Hello, literature lovers. Today I will discuss short history of English literature. The first chapter begins with Anglo-Saxon period, starting almost 1066 with Norman conquest. Talking about the social background is the making of England, the invasion of Roman Empire in 4th AD, and the attacks of Danish Vikings. Literature includes Beowulf. It is the earliest literature and national epic of Anglo-Saxon period, one of the very striking features. Another epic that can be pointed out is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Alliteration was used in a greater context at that time. An epic is a long narrative poem in elevated style presenting characters of high position in series of adventures which form an organic whole. Talking about the medieval period starting with 15th century. Norman conquest is by William, who is the Duke of Normandy, and Battle of Hastings in 1066, the mark of establishment of feudalism. Literature includes Langland's English Ballad and Romance by Chaucer. Major work was Pear and the Plowman. It's an allegory. Allegory is a form of extended metaphor in which objects, persons, and actions in a medieval narrative are equated with meanings that lie outside the narrative itself. It attempts to evoke a dual interest, one in the events, characters, and setting presented, and the other in the ideas they are intended to convey or the significance they bear. For example, ideas of patience, purity, and truth are symbolized by the person who are characters in the story. Ballad is the important department of English folk literature. A story told in song, usually in 4 line stanza with second and fourth line rhymed of paramount importance are the ballads of Robin Hood. And the romance is the most prevailing kind of literature in feudal England, a long composition, sometimes in verse, sometimes in prose, describing the life and adventures of a noble hero. The romances had nothing to do with the common people. They are composed for noble and in chaos, most of the cases by poet patronizing by the noble. The romance of King Arthur is comparatively the most important for the history of English literature. Chaucer is the founder of English poetry. He is called father of English poetry. Introduced the rhyme stanza, various type from France to England poetry instead of Old English verse. He was the first great poet who wrote in English language, making the London dialect the standard of the modern English speech. Canterbury Tales is a picture of 14th century, beginning with a general prose with the influence of Boccaccio's Decameron. The third stage is the Renaissance, English Renaissance, that is 15th and 16th century. Social background includes 100 Years' War and the new monarchy, weakening of the church power. Literature includes Thomas More, Edmund Spenser, and Francis Bacon. Renaissance marked the transition of the medieval period. It is also called rebirth and revival. It includes the purity of the church from the corruption of the Catholic Roman Church. Next comes humanism, which has a keynote in Renaissance, and the beauty of life and the ability of to perfect himself and to perform. Major works are Utopia by Thomas More, Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, and Essays by Francis Bacon. Dramas including works of Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson, being part of The University Wit. Major works by Shakespeare are as follows. Next comes the period of revolution, that is the Restoration 17th century. Clash between the king and parliament and the civil war begin with the execution of Charles I. Later on, decline of the Commonwealth period. Literary works including the work of Milton, Bacon, Bunyan and Dryden. Heroic couplet was included. Other school was metaphysical school of poetry, which was by Marvell and John Donne. Next is the Enlightenment and the Classicism. It was in the 18th century. Starting with social background, it also called Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, and the light of modern philosophical and artistic idea. Literature is the school of classicism, was there in the rise of the modern novel, including sensationalism. Addison and Steele and Pope are the representative of that period. The modern novel started in the mid-century with Duffy, Swift and Richardson, Fielding and Smollett. Sensationalism started in the mid-18th century. Thomas Gray and the pre-romanticism was part of his work. Later on, Blake and Robert Burns were there. Blake's Burn and Sheridan marked the importance of 18th century. Next comes the Romantic period as a whole, starting with the 18th and 19th century. French Revolution was the great influencer. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats all were major romantic poets. Romanticism really was highlighted here. Lake poets was the group that marked their importance. Essayists including Hazlitt and De Quincey as well as Charles Lamb was very famous. Next comes the critical realistic period with mid and late 19th century. There was a struggle between workers and capitalists. Literature was influenced by Dickens' work talking about the realism. Thackeray and Brown sisters were there. Including it comes George Eliot, poets including Tennyson and Browning. Dramatic monologue was really highlighted. Periods include naturalism, neo-romanticism, aestheticism. Hardy's work were highlighted. Next comes the modern period. This includes the gap between rich and poor. It's because of the post-war analysis. Literature includes the modernist rise of skepticism and capitalism and the irrational philosophy. Works include work of D.H. Lawrence. Angry Young Men period was also there, and modern drama by G.B. Shaw was there in the highlight. All these works were highlighted in greater influence. Bernard Shaw is considered to be the best known English dramatist since Shakespeare. His plays inspired by social criticism. John Goldsworthy carried on his tradition of social criticism, the Irish dramatist. Modernism in drama, the working class drama and the theatre of absurd. John Osborne was the one who started with Angry Young Men. Work of Samuel Beckett made him to win Nobel Prize. Waiting for Godot marked the importance of modernism. In poetry, a revolution against the conventional ideas and forms of Victorian period started with the work of Eliot and Yeats that really resulted in the rise of modern poetry. Both won Nobel Prize. Thanks for listening.